Hello ladies and gentle ladies, and welcome back to another Minecraft modding tutorial for Forge 1.20. And this tutorial we're going to be doing the long awaited menu tutorial so we can have an inventory inside of our GUI. So I do apologize for this being so long delayed. I'll be honest with you guys, I just have not had the motivation to edit these videos. I know there isn't much editing, and I know you guys are going to say that, but it's just a lot of just cutting out blank spaces, which is very boring and repetitive. Hopefully I will actually edit this video in a reasonable time so that you don't have to wait even longer, but we'll see. But anyways, let's continue with the tutorial, or let's get started, I should say. So how are we going to do this? So how are we going to actually start with this tutorial? Well, first of all, you're going to need your basic stuff, right? So you're going to need a block. So as you can see, I've just made an example menu block. I've done the normal stuff. So if you're confused about any of this, then I do recommend you watch my block entity tutorial and also my inventory tutorial for block entities as well, since those are going to be the two kind of major things that we're going to be using as our base here. So I've also registered the block entity inside of our block entity init, and I've also created a block entity class with an item stack handler of a size 27. So it's just going to be making a normal chest sized inventory here. And the rest of it is just all the basic stuff that we've had previously. And what else have I done? I've also registered like a block item and stuff, but those are just kind of expected, right? So, okay, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to come into our block entity. So let's go block entity. Let's go example menu block entity. Now what we're going to need to do is implement menu provider. Then we're going to want to add in the two methods that it wants, which is going to be get display name and create menu. So we're going to add these in. Now for the get display name, we just need to return a component that represents the title that will be used inside of our GUI. Now whilst you can just return a component that you create inside of this method, I don't recommend you do that personally. I instead recommend that we come to the top of this class and just create a constant component that we can use. So I'll say private static final component title is equal component dot translatable, and I'm just going to quickly turn Copilot off because it gets in the way here. And inside of this I'm going to say container dot, and then we're going to want to do plus our mod ID, so tutorial mod.mod ID plus dot example menu block, and I'm just going to put that on a new line as well so that we can read the whole thing. So from there we can actually go ahead and just return that in our get display name, so return title, and that is obviously something you're going to want to add to your lang file. So we'll go resources assets tutorial mod lang enus, and you'll see the container tutorial mod example menu block, and I've already added that in here just to keep it nice and simple. Then we need to do this create menu method. Now this is actually going to be super simple, so we don't really need to worry about this too much, but all we're going to want to do is do example menu, and we're going to pass in basically all of these parameters here. So we're going to say p container ID, we're going to say p player inventory, and we're also going to take in this, and you'll see why we need to take in this later. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go into our block class, and we're going to want to actually open the screen. So what we need to do to open the screen is we need to say if player is instance of a server player, and I'm just going to call this S player to keep it nice and simple. Then what we're going to want to do is we're going to say S player dot open menu, and we're going to need to give it the menu provider, which is going to be our block entity, which as you can see I've defined up here by checking if it's an instance of. I just do a simple pattern match to get our block entity. And we're also going to want to take in the position, so pos, And then we're also going to want to take in something that is able to write our position to a friendly byte buffer. And I'll explain that more in a second, but I'll just show you what we need to do here. So all we need to say is we need to say buffer and buffer dot write. Is that right? Let's just say open menu. You see it has a consumer of a friendly byte buff, and that actually doesn't take in a position. Let's just quickly check this. Lovely. So we actually don't need to do that, since we can just take in the block pos parameter. That's actually good to know, and I didn't know that, I'll admit that. But that saves us a bit of time there. So we can just pass in that position and it writes it for us. Now, if we wanted to write additional data that we wanted to send into our menu, then we would need to use the one with the buffer. And we do, for example, buff.write block pos. Where's block pos, hey? Right. Block pos, there you go, and pos, and that will kind of write that to the buffer, meaning we can then access that inside of our block entity, inside of our menu. You'll see what I mean by that in a second, but for now we're just going to say pos, because we don't want to pass in any additional data. In the future, for example, in the fluid tutorial, we are probably going to utilize this a little bit more, and you'll see quite what I mean by that. Then we're going to want to actually create our menu. So let's first actually register a menu type, and then we'll create the menu associated with that menu type. So in our init package, we're going to want to create a new class, and I'm just going to call this menu init. This is going to have our deferred register as normal of menu type question mark, and I'm going to call that menu underscore types is equal deferred register dot create forge registries dot menu types. Then we're going to give it our mod ID as we normally do. You'll see that's gone over the line here, so I'll just put that on a new line. Then we're going to want the actual menu registry object type. So we'll go public static final registry object of type menu type of type, and then this is going to be the class that our menu is going to be called. So mine will just be example menu, and I'm going to call that example menu is equal menu types dot register, and then the name, which will need to be example menu. Then we're going to want to do a supplier of iForge menu type dot create, and we're going to pass in there example menu : new. And if we just put that on a new line, we do actually have an error here because I forgot to put a comma, and there you go. So now we can just register this deferred register, of course, in our main class. So we'll go menu init dot menu types dot register bus, and now let's create this actual menu class, and make sure you put the menu in there, not the menu block, which it obviously tried to auto-complete to. Now I'm going to create a new package for this. So I'm going to go a new package, and I'm just going to call this menu. Inside of here, I'm going to create my example menu class, and this is going to extend abstract container menu. And hopefully you'll see that has fixed that error there. We'll still have this one here, but you don't need to worry about that too much, because that will fix itself once we create our necessary constructor. So inside of example menu, we're going to want to create two different constructors. We're going to want a server constructor, and we're going to want a client constructor. So we'll start with the server constructor, since our client constructor is actually just going to call our server constructor. So we'll go, I'm going to make a quick comment for this. I'm going to say / server constructor, and this will be public example menu, because it's a constructor. Now this is going to take in our container ID, then it's going to take in the player inventory, which will be just player inv, and then it's also going to take in our block entity, which we're just going to make a normal kind of block entity class. There we go. And in the super, we're going to call menu init dot example menu dot get, and then also pass in that container ID too. So that just passes in our actual MenuType registry object that we created, and obviously calling .get so that we can get the MenuType from our registry object, as you would do. Now let's also implement these methods so that we can fix that error there, and you'll see that now works for our block entity. So inside of our block entity, you'll see that this error is now resolved. And I'm actually just going to do that real quick so we can fix that error there. Fix that one there as well. Not errors, I mean just warnings, but we like to fix them anyways. So that's basically all done with our block entity class, which is lovely. Now let's also create the client constructor. So client constructor. Now, it's important to note that whilst I'm labeling these as client constructors and server constructors, they're not strictly client and server. It's just that those are kind of the contexts that we are going to be calling them in. You could theoretically call them in a different context, but that's just kind of the context that we will call those specific constructors in will be client and server. So we'll say for the client constructor, it will be an example menu, of course. And it needs our container ID. It also needs the player inventory. And then finally, it needs a friendly byte buff, which will be additional data. Now, what this constructor is going to do, as I stated earlier, is it's going to call our server constructor. So we're just going to do this. We're going to pass it our container ID. We're going to pass it the player inventory. And then from the friendly byte buff, if you remember from our block, when we open the menu, we wrote a block pos in there. And that's how we're actually going to get the block entity here. So if we do additional data, we can read a block pos, but that only gets us a position. And in fact, we need to get a block entity from that position. So that begs the question, how do we get the block entity from a position? Well, we need a level, since a level is how we can access data such as where block entities are. So how do we get a level? Well, as you can see here, we have a player inventory, and luckily a player inventory is always mapped to a player, and a player is always inside of a level. So if you think logically in that chain, we can say player_inv.player.level.get block entity, and we can do additional data.read block pos. And if you add your brackets on there, you see that that should get us a block entity. Now it's important to note that this block entity it gets may not be of the class we want, which is why we're just having to say it's just a block entity. We don't know what type it is in here. Now we're actually going to want to make that this block entity a variable. So we'll say private final, and this will be our example menu block entity, which will be block entity. And whilst we're at it, actually no, we'll create that in a second, so it'll make more sense then. Inside of our server constructor, we're going to say if block entity is instance of, and we'll say if it's instance of our block entity, we'll just call it BE for now. We'll then set this variable here. So we'll say this dot block entity is equal BE, and else. You may think that we can just not do anything else, but in fact we need to throw an exception since this is a final variable. So we will just throw a new illegal state exception, and I'm just going to say in here incorrect block entity class, and I'll say %s passed into example menu, and then we can format that with block entity dot class, block entity dot get class, and we'll just get the canonical name for that. And that just allows us to throw that exception, which is at least a somewhat friendly exception that would only occur in the dev environment, so it should be fine anyways. Then we need to set a level accessor that we can use later on inside of a still valid method that is down here. So for that, we're going to want a variable, and we're going to want a private final container level access, And I like to just call this a level access, since I think that's a lot simpler. And in our constructor, we're going to say this.level access is equal container level access dot create, and we're going to pass in the block entity dot level, and we're going to pass in the block entity position. There we go. Then we can start to create the actual slots that will be used. So I'm just going to create 3 quick methods for this. So we're going to want first the hotbar, since that starts at slot 0 to slot 9. So we'll create player hotbar, and that needs to take in our player inventory. Then we'll create the player inventory, which will also take in the player inventory. And then we'll also take the block entity inventory, if I could type correctly, which is just going to take in our block entity. There we go. Now, before we actually go ahead and fill out those methods, let's just quickly do this still valid method here. So we're going to say, we're just going to call still valid, which is a static method in the example abstract container menu class. This will just take in this.level access, and then it'll take in the player, so p player, and then it also takes in the block that this menu should be valid for, or more specifically, I believe it's actually a list of blocks. No, it is just a singular block. So you could also chain these, like still valid that, or still valid this, etc., etc. You could also do something depending on the player, for example, or player dot is creative, that kind of thing. But we're not going to do those conditions. We're just going to do a normal block init dot example menu block dot get, and that should work fine. Let's just fix these warnings here as well. There we go. And let's also do, no, we'll create these methods first, since I think these make more sense. And let's actually just create a getter for our block entity as well, since we're going to want to use that later on, maybe in the screen or etc. So let's make these methods here. Let's create method, create method, create method. Now, one thing you will want to make sure you do is actually create the GUI. So I'm just going to open paint.net here. Alright, so as you can see, this is my GUI texture. It's literally just a copy of the chest texture. And we've just got a 3x3 for our block entity inventory, a 3x9 for our block entity, a 3x9 for the player, and a 3x1. Nope, I did that wrong again. A 9x1 for the hotbar. So we'll start with the hotbar, since hotbar goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, etc., 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 all the way to 8 right here. And then we start at 9 here. Excuse the horrible the horrible writing, and to 27 right here. And the same is basically in our inventory too. We start at 0 here, and we go to 20, or it's actually 26 here technically, and this would also technically be 26 here, and this is wrong. This should be 0 0 1 2 3. You get the point anyways. So we'll start with the hotbar, since that's going to be the easiest to start with, since it is just a singular row. So we're going to first want the top left position of this slot, and it's important that you grab the inside position. So you'll see down at the bottom here it says 8 and 142. Now you can obviously do this in any art software. You don't need paint.net. You can use Photoshop, you can use GIMP, you can use Sprite, you can use Critter, you can use Photopea, whatever. I just choose to use paint.net because that's what I'm most familiar with, and I find it nice and easy. So I grabbed that top left. We can see it's 8 and 142. So what we'll do is we will say we're going to want a for loop for each of the columns. So we'll say for I, and I'm going to call this column. We'll start at 0, that's fine. And we're going to say less than 9. And what we're going to do is we're going to call add slot. We're going to do a new slot. Now it's going to want the index, which is just going to be the column. But first of all, it actually wants the inventory, which is just the player inventory. Then it wants the index, which is the column. Then it wants the X position, which is just going to start at 8. So we'll do 8. plus, and then we're going to want to do column times 18. Now the reason we're timesing by 18 is because, as you can see, each of these slots is 16 across, and then you're going to want to plus 2 for this border here between that slot and the next slot, which brings you to here, which is 18 away from here. So that's why we're doing times 18. So for each one it would add another 18 on. And then for the Y position, that was just 142. So you see that's nice and simple for the hotbar. Now the player inventory will really be much the same, but instead we're just adding an additional dimension, which is the Y axis, so the row. So we're going to want another for loop, which will be for the row. And this row is going to be less than 3, row plus plus. Then we're going to want another for I, which will be for the column. And column is going to be less than 9, column plus plus, of course. Then we add slot, we do a new slot, we pass in our player inventory. Then we need to give it the index, which is now going to be slightly different. So we start with 9 because we're starting from right here, which, if you remember, this is 0, this is 8, that makes this one 9, this one 26, right? So this starts at 9, so we'll say 9 plus, and then we're going to do column plus row, and then we do row times 9. So the reason we have to do row times 9 is because for each new row, we're going to add another 9. So I just want to kind of put that in brackets to demonstrate that. And then what we're going to want to do is do the X position. So that's just going to be the exact same as what it was for our hotbar. We start at 8, we go plus, column, times 18 to give us that gap between each of the slots. Then we're going to want the Y, so let's figure out what the Y is, the starting Y. That's going to be 84, so we'll do 84 plus row times 18, because once again, the same on the Y-axis, there is a gap of 18 between here and here because of a border of 2 and a size of 16. So we go times 18. Okay, once we've done that, we can just fix the brackets there. There we go. And finally, we can do our block entity inventory. Now this is really going to be much the same, so we can actually just copy paste this. But there is one important thing to mention, and that is that we can't just make a new slot, and we also don't have an inventory to provide this slot with either. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to want to get the optional. So if you recall from our block entity, we have a method get optional, which gets us our lazy optional of our item stack handler, aka our inventory. And we can just say if this optional is present, then we have our inventory. And with this inventory, we can place in the for loop. Now, that still doesn't allow us to do a new slot. As you can see, it doesn't like that because it's not a container. So what we actually need to change this slot to is a new slot item handler. And that takes in our inventory. Now, these positions here aren't going to be quite right. These two loops should be fine. So we start at 0, go to 3, 0 to 9. That's fine for us since that's going to be exactly the same. But for the actual positions, that's going to be slightly different. So first of all, for the index, we're not going to need to do plus 9 since we don't have a hotbar. So we'll do column plus row times 9. That's fine. Then what we're going to have is the X position. Now that's going to be exactly the same, of course, because our X for this inventory up here is exactly the same as this X here. So that's still going to be 8 plus column times 18. It is just the Y position that's going to be different. So we'll see what the top Y position is. And you should see that it's also going to be 18, which makes it a little bit confusing because we're doing 18 plus 18. But just remember that this is a different 18 than this 18. You can make like constants for these if you wish, if you think that would be better. But I'm not going to do that personally. Now, one thing I will just quickly mention, if you wanted to say, for example, have a specific slot be different than another slot, so maybe this slot could only have swords in it, then you might want to create a class for this slot item handler, and you might want to override can place which I think it's called, place, may place. There you go, may place, and just return, like, for example, stack.is items.diamond sword. For example, you might do something like that. And you also have may take, may pick up. There you go, which you can do kind of the same kind of logic. And there's some other methods in here as well that you can override. You can see all of them here. That you can override any of these, and you can also override those for the player inventory as well. I don't know why you would do that, but you can. So if you wanted to, you can also like create a class for these ones, and obviously that's an anonymous class, but you can also make like your own class. So public static class my slot extends slot item handler, right? You can pass in, you can make your constructor, and then you can override your like may place in here, and that just maybe allows you to have reusability. For example, if you're doing a fuel slot, you might want to have that reusable for any of your block entities and whatever, so you might want to make a slot that's reusable for that, which we'll cover more when we do a furnace tutorial, hopefully fairly soon. But we're going to remove that since we don't want that. And that's pretty much it. You'll see though the final thing here is quickMoveStack, which is going to be a little bit of a pain in the arse. So I hope you guys are ready for this one. And I'll try and explain this the best I can, but it's not super easy. So what we'll start with is getting the slot that we actually want to start with. So by the way, quickMoveStack is when you, for example, shift click a stack from one slot to another. So we'll start with the from slot, and this is the slot that it's basically going to start with. So that'll just get the slot at p index. So this is the slot that we're going to try and move from. And we're going to get the item stack from that slot. So I'll just say from stack is equal from slot dot get item. Now once we have that, we're going to first check if the count of this stack is less than or equal to 0. So if from stack.count is less than or equal to 0, then we're just going to set that from stack, or we're going to set the from slot to item stack.empty. So that just means it's set an empty item stack into that slot. And then we'll just say if from slot does not have item, right? So if it doesn't have an item, then we're just going to return an empty item stack. Because we don't want to try and quick move an empty item stack. That just doesn't make any sense. Then we're going to copy our from stack so we can make some modifications. So we'll say item stack, and we're going to call this copy from stack, and that will just be equal to from stack.copy. So we've made a copy. Then we're going to say if the index, right? So if index is less than 36. So if we are inside of the player inventory, right, because we're going to do 9, and that's actually one thing that I did kind of forget about here. This is index 36, right, not 27, because we're adding 9. I completely forgot about that, but yeah, this is 36, not 27. That's a silly mistake I made. But if we're less than 36, right, so if we're inside of the player's inventory, then what we're going to do is, let's just add a comment for that. What we'll try to do is we will try to move an item stack. We're going to move the from stack. We're going to move it from 0 to 36. And we'll say false because we want that to actually happen. We don't want to reverse the direction that happens in. And what that will try to do is that will try to move that slot starting at 0 to all the way down to 36. And if it can't do that, so if it can't do that using the not, then we're just going to return an empty item stack, because that means that the player's inventory is full, right? So we'll return an empty item stack. Now we're going to say else if index is less than 63. So what that means that we are inside of the block entity inventory, right? Because 36 plus 27 is 63. Obviously, if you had your block entity have a different sized inventory, you'd need to change this number to something else. For example, say you only had 2 slots, you might say that this is 38, since you're doing 36 plus 2, right? So that kind of thing. But we have 63 because it's 36 plus and then our 27 slots. So if we're inside of the block entity inventory, we're going to once again try and move that stack, and we're going to try and move it. Actually, this is wrong. My bad. So this should actually be 36 and 63. I got this the wrong way around. So for inside of the player inventory, we want to try and move it into our block entity inventory, meaning between 36 and 63, because 36 is the player's inventory and 63 is the end of our inventory. So yeah, if it can't move it in there, that means our block entity inventory is full. And if we're less than 63, then that means we're inside of the block entity, and so we're going to try and move it in the player's inventory. So we'll go from stack, and we're going to say between 0 and 36. And we're going to say false because we don't want to reverse it. And if we can't move it, that means the player's inventory is full, and we once again just return an empty item stack. And else, so if there is somehow an else, we're going to need to sys or I think it's sir, yeah, sir, there you go. And we can say just invalid slot index, because in this circumstance, we're not inside of the player's inventory, and we're not inside of the block entity's inventory, so somehow we've got an invalid index, and I don't know how that would happen. That could only happen is if you got this 63 number wrong for your specific inventory. But for us, it would be 63, so that's going to be correct, and this should never happen for us, but maybe it will for you, and if it does, then you know how that's happened now. And if all of those if checks have passed, and we're still we're able to actually move the stack, then we'll do from slot.setChanged. That just causes a quick update saying it's ready to be changed, and then we're going to say from slot.onTake, and we're going to say player, which is p-player, my bad, and then we are going to say from stack, and we will return our copy like that, and that should work. So hopefully that all makes sense. I know that's a little bit confusing, and it's always quite hard to explain this because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of logic here that you can also very easily mess up. If you don't want to try and type out all this and you're scared of getting it wrong, my GitHub is obviously always linked in the description, so if you really want to, you can just copy the code for this method here, and you know that will help a little bit more. But that's basically it, at least as far as I'm thinking. We do need to do the screen though, so let's go into the client. We're going to create a new class in screen, and we're going to call this example menu screen. Now what this needs to do is this needs to extend abstract container screen, and it's going to take in example menu. We're going to want our constructor, so let's first it actually wants us to implement the render background method, but then it's going to want the constructor, which is fine. We can just super all of those. Then we're going to want to set the image width and image height. So I'm just going to kind of brush through this since we covered this in our screen tutorial. So this.image width is equal 176, and this.image height is equal 166. We can just check that obviously inside of here. So we'll go down here, we'll say the size 176, 166, so that is fine. Now inside of render background, this is just the method that's called when it tries to render the background of our GUI. So we'll call render transparent background, and we'll pass in those GUI graphics, which will basically darken the area around it. Then we're going to want to just draw our texture, so we'll go p-GUI graphics.blitz. We're going to pass in our texture. We're going to start at this.left pos, this.top pos. UV will start at 0, and then we'll do this.image width and this.image height. Once again, I'm not going to explain that too much since we covered that kind of in the previous GUI tutorial. And we're also going to want to override the render method. We'll call the super, and then after we call the super, we call render tooltip, which is going to take in our GUI graphics, the mouse X, and the mouse Y. And let's also add that as not null. And then let's also create a quick resource location for our texture here. So resource location texture is equal a new resource location. That's going to take in our mod ID, so mod.mod ID. Then it's going to be textures /GUI /example menu screen. and make sure you add .png on the end as well. Obviously, just make sure that's the correct path. So for me, assets, tutorial mod, as you can see. Then inside textures, GUI, textures, GUI, example menu screen, .png. So just make sure you get that obviously correct. But that's it for our screen class. Now we do need to bind that screen class to our menu. So we're going to come inside of client, and you're going to want a new package for handler. And inside of that class, I'm going to create a new class for client mod handler. Now we're going to annotate this class with @mod.eventBusSubscriber. That's going to take in our mod ID, so tutorial mod.mod Then it's also going to take in the bus, which is going to be bus.mod. Then it's also going to take in the value, which is going to be this.client. Then inside of here, we're going to want @subscribe_event. We're going to go public static void client setup. This will take in an FML client setup event. We're going to do event.enqueue_work. This will give it a runnable, of which we can do menu screens .register menu init, so our menu type basically, example menu.get, and then just our screen class, so example menu screen new. And I'm just going to add a quick to do in here saying add more later, since we're going to add more in here later, and that also just kind of gets rid of the warning which we would otherwise get. Yeah, all of that is done. And that should be it. So I know I tried to go a little bit faster there at the end, but as you can see, this tutorial is already quite long. So let's go ahead and run the game, and hopefully we should see that everything works perfectly fine. So I will see you there. Alright, ladies and gentle ladies, so here we are in the game, and let's see what we did wrong, shall we? Let's see what crashes. So we're going to open it. Everything actually looks fine, so all the slots are in the correct places. If you see that some of the slots are offset, that may mean that you've got the math a little bit wrong. You may just want to double check those values. You'll see that the titles are automatically rendered for us. We have tooltips and we can move stuff. Let's see if we can quick move. We can, so that all works. And obviously if we do this, presumably we can still quick move. We can, lovely. You'll see it quick moves to the next stack that it can. That's good. That's how it's meant to work. Okay. Now let's just check that it saves. I know that wasn't kind of something we covered, but just in case something went horribly wrong there, we should see that that still works. It should definitely still work. Yeah, it does still work. So that's all fine. I think that's basically everything really, isn't it? So I hope you guys found this tutorial useful, and if you did, please do be sure to give it a like and subscribe. I don't know why I'm lagging so much. And yeah, if you really enjoyed it and found it useful, then it would be great if you could join my Patreon. It just does help to support me. I don't know why I'm lagging so much. What have I done? Is this something I've done, or is this just jank? But yeah, obviously you can join my Patreon. It does help to support me. And yeah, I'll see you in the next tutorial, which will be, I don't know, if I'm honest with you. Probably energy, but possibly either could be fluid handling or sided inventories. I'm not sure which I'm going to do as of right now, but it'll probably be one of those. More likely energy, since that's really, really easy. And you'll kind of see why that's so easy when we do it. But yeah, I will see you then. Goodbye.